in for Africa. I'm in it for Africa.
I'm in for Africa.
I am in for Africa.
I'm in for Africa.
I am in for Africa.
In for Africa.
I'm in for Africa.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. I'm happy to facilitate and moderate this session around the topic Africa post-COVID-19, reimagining and reinventing the next world. Thank you for joining this conversation. Thank you for joining this dialogue. From a wet market in Wuhan, China, the coronavirus has become a health and economic pandemic that is transforming the landscape of our societies and the world in just a few months. Spurred on by the globalization of trade, this invisible and vicious adversary has spread throughout the circuits of modernity, economy, education, transportation, logistics, trade, tourism, entertainment. Nothing has been spared from this virus, which has become a threat to international security and even a striking parable about the dangers of our interconnected world. African continent, placed in the global narrative of the coronavirus pandemic as a final frontier, has not escaped its aftermath. As early as March 19, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, Director General of WHO, warned of the devastating effect of the virus due to the vulnerability of health system, the difficulties in efficiently tracing and testing, and the history of devastating pandemic on the continent. The memory of the Ebola pandemic is still vivid. While more than 5 months later, the continent is relatively unscattered by this pandemic, the economic and development pandemic is still very much with us. According to UNCA, the coronavirus pandemic has already affected the African continent in two ways. The loss of an estimated of $69 billion since the lockdown, and the drop of the growth forecast. World Bank even warns that Africa will experience its first recession in 25 years, and the projection suggests that the region will be hit by the hardest in terms of increased extreme poverty. My conviction, is that we can change this narrative if we can draw on our genius, our resilience, and our resources to reimagine, rethink, and reinvent Africa by taking advantage of the shifts and opportunities offered by this pandemic. And this is exactly the goal and the purpose of this dialogue between esteemed personalities with the experience, insight, and analytical relevance to think the next world, the next Africa. On the theme Africa post-COVID-19, I've announced it, reimagining and reinventing the next world, because we definitely need reimagination, reinvention to recover together, to recover better, and to recover stronger. And I'm happy and I'm honored to introduce you our guest today. The first one is Stanislas ZEZE, who is the chairman of Bloomfield Investment Corporation. Stanislas ZEZE is one of the most influential voice and personality in the investment industry and the economic industry in West Africa. He's the founder and the chairman of Bloomfield Investment Corporation, who is a Pan-African, which is a Pan-African rating agency based in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. My first guest, our second guest, sorry, today is Caroline KENDE-ROBB, Senior Advisor at the African Center for Economic Transformation, based in Ghana. Caroline, you are currently Senior Advisor at this leading think tank and do tank on the African continent. You have been also working since 3 decades in development space, and prior to this, you worked closely with the late Kofi Annan, former General Secretary of the United Nations, as Executive Director of the Africa Progress Panel, a foundation which included leading personalities like Michel Kamdesus, Peter Hagen, Bob Geldof, President Olusegun Obasanjo, Mr. Tidjane Thiam, the current Special Envoy of African Union to the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you so much, Caroline, to join this panel. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the expertise you will share with us. Our third guest today is Her Excellency Ameenah GURIB. Her Excellency Ameenah GURIB-FAKIM, former President of Mauritius. Her Excellency Ameenah GURIB-FAKIM, you served as the 6th President of Mauritius from 2015 to 2019. You served as the first woman elected as president of the country. You are also an international renowned and award-winning biologist. We are happy and we are really honored to have you to share your expertise, your vision, and your experience on this conversation. It is a privilege to welcome you. Thank you so much, President Fakim, for being with us. And yeah, in the name, on behalf of the INFORAFRICA Alliance, I would like to thank you so much for joining this session, to share your experiences, to share your vision, to shape and reshape the future of the continent. And my first question, and as I was introducing, this conversation will be structured around 5 topics. The third one will be public health. The second one will be education and workforce employment issues. The third one will be around a development model. We will have a topic around climate issues, and the last one will be around regional integration and multilateralism. My first question will be maybe general. How did you experience in your own country, Stanislas, you in Abidjan, Caroline in Switzerland, President GURIB, you in Mauritius. Yeah, how did you experience this pandemic, this crisis in your respective countries? Stanislas.
Okay, thank you very much. We here in Côte d'Ivoire, and I guess in the YMU region, the reaction to the pandemic has been systematic by different governments, and they took very strong measures, such as closing the borders, introducing curfew, closing down all businesses, actually, reduce the number of people who can be in the meetings, and also a great sensibilization on the social distancing, washing hands, and all these things. So the reaction has been very prompt and very quick. Now, I guess the first month was okay because everybody thought that it was necessary. But I guess after 1 month, or after 3 months now, 2.5 months now, and then we see some sort of stagnation in actually progression of the health issues, the health pandemic. We now realize that perhaps it's time to adjust or to readjust all the measures according to the evolution of the pandemic, but also to the reality of the country, of different countries in the region. I mean, I'm talking especially about Côte d'Ivoire now, because there's no adequation between the strong measures taken now and the environment. I think that the most critical issue that the government will have to deal with today is more of the economic and social consequences of this pandemic. So after saying that the measures taken earlier when the pandemic broke out was excellent, but today it's time to adjust. Otherwise, the economic consequences will be so dramatic that when you compare that to the health consequences, you realize that after all, these countries did not capitalize on the fact that the health consequences have been sustained. So overall, things in the health front seems to be stabilized, because in Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, you have, I guess, close to 3,000 cases, and half of them are cured, and then you have around 20 deaths. So compared to other parts of the world, I think this has been well contained. But now it's time to adjust the measures and then start thinking of the economic consequences.
And the recovery as well. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Stanislas, for this brief introduction. And yeah, Mrs. Kende, Caroline, how did you experience this pandemic? You in Switzerland, I guess?
Yes, so yes, thank you for the question. So in Switzerland, you will probably recall this was a country which was very hard hit at the beginning of the crisis and had one of the highest per capita cases and the highest per capita death rate as well. And we were hit from Italy, as well as from the skiing, and the skiers all came and then spread the virus all over Europe, in fact. So I'm British, so what I can give you in a nutshell is the response in Switzerland and then the response in the UK and the difference. So in Switzerland, the government were very clear. They locked down very quickly. They cancelled an international car show very early on. And then they said quite simply, everybody, you have to stay at home, work from home, and don't mix with more than 5 people. That was it, just more than, it didn't say who it was, blah, 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 but no more than 5 people in each group. Super simple to follow, schools closed down, etc. And it was a very well-organized response, and now the schools have gone back. At one point we had 35,000 cases, we've had 2,000 deaths. And now we have like 3 cases a day and 1 or 2 deaths a day. So far, so good. We all know that we can't predict anything with this virus. We are all aware there could be a second wave. This situation in Switzerland is very different to the one in the UK. They did not lock down quickly. It is quite a chaotic process. The rules are multi-layered, and the rate is still quite high, even though they're talking about unlocking. So we've got really a different contrast here. But importantly, what the Swiss are doing, And what WHO are also saying, if you come out of lockdown, it's not time to celebrate, it's time to prepare. And that's exactly what you have been saying. What should be our recovery? How can we recover, and how can we recover better? What are the opportunities? What policies can we change? So absolutely very different stories here, UK, Switzerland.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you for this really precious insight. Mrs. President, what about you in Mauritius? You passed the lockdown, your lockdown in Mauritius, I guess.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I think I'll just recap what the previous speakers have said. We went into lockdown as from the 20th of March, and it's only last Sunday that the lockdown has been again partially lifted because schools are not open yet. They will be open in August. You know, the big public spaces, the gathering is still not allowed. And again, the borders were shut since the 20th of March, and we were imposed curfew. And then, of course, we had to go through all the process of wearing masks and no public gathering, more than 2 or 3 people, and all the mass gathering, they were completely forbidden. Now, we recorded 332 infections and we had 10 deaths. So judging by the population size of 1.2 million, which makes us quite impacted for the African continent by virtue of per capita and the deaths recorded. Now, having said this, now that the lockdown is lifted, at least partially since last Sunday, again, we are again at the situation of where do we see ourselves in terms of the economics, because we are an island and we are highly dependent on tourism. And tourism, of course, has been completely wiped off, at least for the best part of 2020. When will that recover full speed? We don't know, but that's already 23% of the economy which is impacted. It is predicted that the economy will contract by 10% at least. And as from tomorrow, when the budget is going to be read, we're going to see a big stimulus package which is going to be given. But we don't know which sectors this stimulus package will go to, because what do we do with the hotels when there's no tourism? Because we depend on the airlines, we depend, of course, on the opening of the airspace of other countries as well. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but I think all the speakers have mentioned, we're quite right. Where do we see ourselves? Because the projections that were estimated by even WHO at the beginning of the pandemic for Africa has not been met, because they were predicting hundreds of thousands of deaths, and we didn't see that, fortunately. But some countries have been quite badly impacted. And as this virus is a new beast, we don't know what the second wave will look like. And if we are going to have a second wave, again, we don't know. What shape will it take? Because judging by whether we'll develop herd immunity, and to what extent we can still depend on the testing. Do we go for mass testing, or do we still resort to just the serology? And to what extent we still maintain the mass testing as has been done in other countries. But the issue still lies on the economics, because the testing costs a lot of money. Again, it's a matter of affordability at country level, to what extent they can roll out the various measures that have been prescribed by the WHO and other organizations. So we're still at a very uncertain time, just like every other country. But for us, that we depend so much in terms of imports from other countries, basic food stuff. So it's all a matter of preparedness, and we'll see rollout over the next few weeks. Now that we have opened up, what is going to be the real impact in the short, medium, and of course in the long term?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Her Excellency. And I think that we have some time to talk about those economic issues. And you mentioned the point around public health, around the difficulties for our countries, in Africa to invest in testing and mass testing. And this is a good transition to our first topic around public health. we can all agree that one of the major lessons, okay, we can learn from this pandemic, for instance, is that there is no development, there is no emergence or prosperity when access to health and well-being is not universal, when healthcare infrastructures are not performant. And as Africa did a lot of progress on infrastructures, roads and macroeconomics governance those last 20 years, do you think, Mrs. President, that the next decade, the after coronavirus decade, this upcoming decade, is and should be the decade of health and human capital? And according to you, how do we link better development and health issues in the light of this pandemic?
Thank you. I think when we talk about health on the continent, I think we need to ourselves change the narrative, because to me, we need to invest more in the health space. We need to invest in the public health infrastructure. And I think what the COVID has done to all of us on the continent, it has revealed the state of preparedness or the state of unpreparedness of our health system. So I think when we talk about the measures which have been imposed already upfront by the WHO, when we talked about social distancing, we talked about washing your hands, we were already pointing to some very serious limitations in our societies. How do you social distance when many people are living in one room in many parts of our continent? How do you promote a washing of your hands when water is an issue in many parts of Africa? So these are things which challenge us in terms of investing in the appropriate infrastructure throughout the region. And again, when we talk about investment in the healthcare system, we're not talking about the fine end of the very complicated, very expensive healthcare system. We're talking about the basic primary healthcare. And this is again has shown that if we had provided, for example, if you go back to the Ebola crisis, because we mentioned that earlier in the conversation, if these countries had the basic investment in water and soap, for example, washing your hands, this could have saved quite a few lives already. So we are talking increasingly about investment in the public health space. And here in Mauritius, we were quite lucky because immediately after independence, investment in education, investment in health, investment in the social safety net, they were there all along. And we found that when we had this pandemic, we could rely on the fact that these services, these were completely accessible and they were free. So health, social safety net, and education are free in Mauritius. So these are the issues that we have to really think in the medium to long term, to what extent this investment can be thought of. And I use the word investment here because we are not talking about expenses, we are talking about investment. And you talk about the human capital. Where is the state of preparedness in terms of the human capital on the continent? What is the ratio of doctors to population? Again, we find it's very, very weak. So these are issues that we have to really relook at: the investment in the education space, the investment in the health space, and increasing the state of preparedness. Now, why I say increase the state of preparedness, because I don't think we've seen the end of Corona as we know it, because we are still very much waiting for if and when there is a second wave. But in terms of preparedness for other pandemics, because we've had pandemics before, and I don't think we've seen the end of pandemics, because with all the issues confronting the African continent and the world, and one of them being climate change, we haven't seen the end of pandemics. So it is up to us to invest in this space so that our institutions and our countries are more prepared. And one institution that has been set up by the African Union, the African CDC, I think they will have a big role to play in terms of responding and in terms of preparing institutions and government on the need to invest in the public health space and the other areas that we have talked about.
Thank you so much, Her Excellency, and thank you for those precious insight and for this vision. And you talk a lot about investment, and Stanislas, this may be a point for you, because as in the context of reduction of budget margin for the majority of African countries, of recession, we have talked about a recession, how do we found and how do we mobilize resources to invest in public health?
Thank you. I have to totally agree with His Excellency, as she pointed out. It's not the amount of money you put in the healthcare. It's how you put in the money and how you organize. It's a matter of organization. Okay, she talked about basic healthcare. It's a matter of how for 60 years, most countries in Africa have been independent for 60 years. And when the pandemic broke out, we saw how weak and not resilient the system of health were. What it means that we haven't been able to anticipate. Because I mean, this time, as she clearly pointed out, this time is a health pandemic. It could be another shock, another pandemic, or another external shock. It could be any shock. It just showed our incapacity to get prepared. So we do not anticipate as if we live on a day-by-day basis. And this is very dangerous. I think what needs to be done, we need to rethink our model. We need to have a model. And she said it clearly at the beginning of the independence. Mauritius had three priorities: health, education, and social safety net. And this is what is the biggest challenge for African country, to redefine their priority when it comes to health. What are the priorities? So we need a strong political will to reorganize the public health in a way that we can anticipate on potential pandemic, potential health issues, and be able to absorb the shock, be able to be resilient when it happens. So if we invest in prevention, it doesn't have to be very expensive. Investing in prevention, it could be educating people on washing their hands, making water available, perhaps educating people on avoiding. We know that in our African culture, people are always gathering, always together. They're very affectionate, so they're always touching each other. Educate people on the consequences of being on each other, touching each other all the time. And so to me, it's a matter of organization. How we organize to anticipate on all of the potential crises. Now, in terms of investing in health infrastructure and other infrastructure in this time of crisis, the first thing I said when this war broke out, I'm sure that this pandemic broke out, I know that we're certainly going to be talking about that in the future, in the future of our discussion in terms of debt. I said to many countries with whom we're working that the first thing that you do when you're facing a liquidity crisis is not to go and look for more liquidity. The first thing you do, you look at your expenditures and your expenses. What can you save? How can you rearrange your expenditure? Because we have a lot of waste. this is the time to actually reorganize your budget in a way that you can actually eliminate the waste. Eliminate what you think is not urgent, what you think that you can postpone, and then make the savings, the necessary saving, and rearrange your priorities. And once you do that, and you're still short of cash, then you can go look for more money. Because what a lot of people are starting, a lot of countries are starting to do, they're starting to actually borrow, and then you're coming to create more problems that you will solve, actually. So you have to look at what you actually doing now. How can you save money? Look at in Africa, you have a lot of institutions that are not really useful. They're using a lot of capital, but they're not useful. You have an entity that they call Conseil économique et social. Who do they advise? The president have his advisors, ministers have their advisors, prime minister have his advisors. So this entity use a lot of capital because you have to set up a budget for them. But usually the work that they're doing, nobody's using it. So those are institutions that you can actually eliminate to save money. We need to, these countries need to reorganize their priorities in the way that they will actually save a lot of money so that they can invest in health, invest in education, as His Excellency says. And those are the basics for the country to actually expect to move forward. You have to have these basics. So I guess, fortunately for us, this pandemic have actually revealed the weaknesses of most health system. Now we're hoping that this is not just going to be a short-lived shock. We're hoping that this shock going to actually urge politicians to have a real political will to reorganize the health system in the way that this health system, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of organization, in terms of strategy, be able to be resilient, sufficiently resilient to absorb any potential health pandemic or health shock.
Okay, thank you so much, Stanislas, for this plea for a radical rationalization of our institution in terms of saving capital and investing those expenditures. Thank you so much, Stan. Caroline, you have a comment and a contribution around this point.
Yes, thank you very much. I just want to really build on the points of the previous speakers, what Her Excellency said, and also what Stanislas said. And really, if we look at issues of political will, I think that's really, really important. And there's this fantastic article by Yuval Harari, and he wrote right at the beginning of the pandemic, and he said, we are making decisions now in a matter of minutes that we would normally take years to make. And this is what this crisis is forcing us to do. It's forcing us to make decisions extremely quickly that have been dragging and dragging for years. And so just linked to what the speakers have been saying, this is an opportunity now to look at things that have been dragging for years that are incredibly difficult to reform. And a great example is, in fact, the health sector, as well as the education sector. I mean, at the moment, we've got billions of children working from home globally. That would never happen, ever, right? And the decision was made like that. And it's reforming the education system. And we now need to reform the health systems. But what this virus also does, it lays bare the inequalities that are in all our societies, and in African countries, in European countries. It's laying those inequalities bare. And that's what we really need to move on. We really need to move quickly on. So sometimes we hear that there's an excuse, oh, there's not the political will to do this. We would argue, at Asset, the think tank where I work, that this is in fact an opportunity to change policies, to change these policies quickly, especially in looking at rationalisation of how governments are set up. Why do we have multiple government departments that you have to go to if you're looking at agriculture supply chains, which are vital at this moment in time? It's like this headache. You have to go to about 20 different departments and ministries just to try and think through what can we do to enhance and better ensure that agriculture supply chains are working in this very challenging time. But I also want to mention very quickly this word resilience, which I think is very, very important. You know, all countries are really suffering. There's an issue of global resilience in the context of climate change, which we cannot afford to forget. And then there's the issue around national resilience. And very importantly, there's the issue around community resilience. When this pandemic first hit us, we all thought this is a health problem. We need a health response. And then we were thinking, actually, no, we need a quick fiscal response. But what we realized is we also need to bring in, listen to, and build a community response, which is built on community resilience. And this is where Africa has a lot of wealth, and it's around the functionings of communities, the functionings of the social capital. How do different social groups work together to support each other? Because in other communities, in other countries, that's not as strong as it is in Africa. So I would say that this resilience word is going to become even more important in multiple contexts. And on the health front, you can have all your great hospitals, but you should also be investing in community health response. And that is really, really important to build on the structures that already exist and to enable the health response to be local, 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 because we have to be local as well as regional, as well as Pan-African.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Charlene, for this insight. Mrs. President, you have a comment, a contribution around this.
Thank you. I very much like these two words of resilience and political will. But the thing is that for the first one, I totally agree. You know, we need to have the resilience which will be built through investment and what we have discussed so far. But who will distill the political will? That's the thing that we very often, I ask the question, who will distill that political will? And I think this is where we need a strong leadership from our leaders. And we have seen already in the course of the past 3 months, and in fact, many of the leaders have either revealed themselves to be very good and to have been really spot on in terms of addressing the issues. And here I'll put my female hat, and I've said that the leadership we have seen emerging from countries being led by women have been tremendous. They have been different. And this is again something which has been revealed in the pandemic that we need to build on. We need to bring in more women because we do things differently. So that's the question that we have to address, is the issue of leadership. We need to have the leadership at the political level. We need to have leadership at the institutional level. And we need to have, as has been said before, we need to have the leadership at the community level so that, you know, we're all speaking the same language throughout and the communication is going right across. And this is again where we have seen the way that some leaders have been communicating. The compassion they have brought in the course of this pandemic, it has given plenty of results. The fact that a lot of these leaders have surrounded themselves with experts, with communication specialists, with the technicians, again have made a difference in addressing the challenges that these countries were going through. So I think when we talk about the political will, we talk about, to me, it translates to the leadership at that political level. And increasingly, we need to see again in the African continent how we need to have locally bred expert, because this is where we need to have granular data at the level of the community, because it is these data that's going to shape the policies that we're going to take. And again, this is something that we are quite weak on the continent. We haven't been able to invest in our institution, in our people, to get this data, which will shape our policies. So again, this pandemic has revealed that weakness. But having said this, the pandemic, as the speaker have said before, it has revealed how strong we are as a community and how we want to bring in, the necessary, issues that will help, of course, the community at that level. But I find that we need to really, again, see what has happened through this pandemic to bring to bear that investment will be the order of the day, investment so as to be able to make our institution and our communities much more resilient to be able to confront other pandemics which are going to come along.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
I just want to add.
yeah, please, Caroline, go ahead, please.
And this is really basically on we need a different type of leader, and we need a different type of leadership. And I think this virus has laid that very, very bare. And if we look globally, the struggles we have had just trying to get a global coordinated response. And we've been pushing the G20, G20, please meet, you need a global coordinated response. Whether or not it's a fiscal coordinated response, or whether it is just getting the PPE in the right place, the equipment in the right place, the tests in the right place, it has to be globally coordinated. And it's been painful. But the leaders who are reaching out more, who are able to respond better, so far have been women leaders. And the macho male leader, I'm not quite sure that they are doing as good a job. And there is a correlation between the macho male and countries in crisis. And I think it's a very, very important point. And when we step back and we look at this crisis in a few years' time, we will see that the women leaders who are managing their countries differently, who are taking less risks, who are doing things because it's based on different criteria, they are the ones who are being more successful so far in this virus. And we don't know, because we don't know how this virus will pan out. And that, I'm just going to make one more point, and then I'll be quiet. There is a massive gender dimension to this pandemic. And we know that at every level, at the global level around global leadership, about national leaders, what's working, what's not working. Our healthcare, our carers, our healthcare workers, 70% of them are women, and 70% of them have been ignored and told they were not vital for years, right? For years. And then we look at women in the communities. They are the managers of the communities. They are the managers of their households. They are the ones who are going out into the informal sector each day trying to feed their families. They are the farmers. And it's the farming sector that also needs to be completely transformed. So we need to, again, focus on an inequality that's been laid bare by this pandemic, which is a very profound gender inequality. And countries all over the world, they're experiencing a massive increase in gender-based violence. And it's the same in African countries too. We have to take this seriously. We have to talk about it more. And this has to be one of the first things that we continue to look at from now on.
Thank you so much, Caroline.
Just to close the debate.
Yeah, okay.
Frankly, I totally agree with the two ladies. I totally agree. And I think that the good thing about this pandemic, so it's going to lay out our weaknesses, and we're going to realize that today, if we don't change all these weaknesses, if we don't address all the weaknesses, we are not going to be resilient, as we say. So we need political will to address all these weaknesses. And the gender inequality is one of them, one of the biggest weaknesses. And I can tell you, lady, you'll be surprised, but 65% of my staff are women. 60% of the managing board, managing team, are women. So I know exactly the leadership of women. I know exactly the power of the leadership for women. He has worked for me, and I'm sure he's going to be able to work for the world. And I think that today, what we need to understand is that instead of thinking of program to give opportunities to women, is to realize that we shouldn't block women because they're actually doing a fantastic job, and we should see them as a partner because they are showing us a different way of doing things and it's working. So I totally agree with you.
Thank you, Stanislas. And I think that is we are chased by time. Let's just go to the second topic, and I think that the issues of inequalities will come back into this conversation. The second point, the second topic is around a development model and prosperity. And we have started mentioning some issues around this. Major economic sectors are seriously hit and damaged by this pandemic, as we all know. Her Excellency talked about the tourism in Mauritius. We can also witness a price drop of oil, major export commodities such as gold, copper, cocoa for Ivory Coast, for instance, Stanislas, and travel and tourism. And yeah, Stanislas, this question will specifically go to you. With the threat of a recession, with this upcoming currency and debt crisis, how can we recover and prevent the pandemic, the development pandemic, actually?
I think as I said earlier, for the continent, the economic consequences will be more drastic than the health consequences. Having said that, it means that today, this is the excellent opportunity for Africa to rethink its economic model on three major points. The first one is diversification. When you look at a country that actually, whose economy is basically focusing on petrol, okay? And when you look at countries like Angola or Nigeria, where most of the economy is actually concentrated on oil, you see how hard they've been hit. So this is the reason why. I mean, in order to be resilient, the African economy need to be well diversified. When you are a well diversified economy, the capacity to absorb shock is greater. Okay, this is the first thing. The second thing is the transformation of our economy, transformation of raw material. We have to be able to, we should start transforming our raw material. A country like Côte d'Ivoire should now, Côte d'Ivoire is the first producer of cocoa, 40% of the world production. And it basically export most of it, rather than transforming part of it and then exporting part of it. So we have to start transforming our economy. We have to be able to be self-sufficient in all our needs. You can't be a country that actually produces rubber and be importing tire wheels. Doesn't make much of a sense. You can't be a country that is a first producer of cocoa and be importing chocolate and other derivatives from cocoa. Doesn't make much of a sense. Until we start transforming our economies, we are going to continue to be dependent of the outside world. We have to put an emphasis on the domestic market. Our first production should be for the domestic market, and then the extra should be for export. And unless we do that, we are continuing to be weak in terms of resilience. This is very, very, very important. Now, the third thing is also we have to specialize our economy. Okay, it's very important to specialize our economy through decentralization. When you look at most African countries, all the economic activity are concentrated into the capital. So which actually drag all the forces from all over the continent to these big cities who become problem cities. Decentralization will be also a model that will help country develop equally. They need to start having secondary cities that represent an economic development area in order to create jobs, to create opportunity in the different areas of the country, rather than concentrating all the economic activity in the capital city. So I think those are some of the lead that the African countries can actually follow to be able to rethink the economic model. Because today, this pandemic has shown that when you close your borders, then obviously you go into shortage of everything you need. In countries here, this morning, my wife was telling me, listen, I don't have any more contact lenses. Well, because we actually import that from France. So when you get to the point where you close your border, and that's when you realize your weaknesses is most of the things that you need. So I think this also is an opportunity to really put in place a new economic model to diversify our economy, to transform our economy in order to be resilient. And this will actually be possible if we also change our political models, because it goes hand to hand. We live in countries where the political power is so concentrated in the executive and sometimes in only one person, then there's no open discussion, there's no depth reflection on what needs to do in terms of policy. So the policy are basically imposed by the executive to everybody else. There's no control. And this is, of course, what leads to mismanagement. That's what also leads to corruption and bad governance, and we know that. So we need to have a balance of power in terms of political model. A balance of power. If you look at all the countries where you have a balance of power, they put in place good policies because these policies have been discussed, have been argued around, and then come up with them. And then the way the countries manage, or the way the policies have been implemented, the fact that you have a balance of power creates some sort of control, some sort of monitoring, in a way that you can avoid or reduce waste, you can avoid or reduce inequality in the implementation of some of these policies. So those three pillars, if they're being followed in terms of rethinking our model, political model and economic model, because they go hand to hand, I think we have a great chance to actually come out stronger from this pandemic and have a model that is actually will be adequate to a potential economic development.
Thank you so much, Stanislas. Thank you for this great and precious insight. Rethinking, reimagining the next Africa through diversification, transformation, and decentralization. Thank you so much. And I would turn to Caroline. You signed a few days ago an op-ed alongside Minister Ngozi and more than 50 other leaders of the world, calling G20 for a debt relief for the 76 International Development Association countries. in order to tackle and to give them some budgetary margins to tackle this pandemic and recover. I would be happy, we would be happy to have your views and ideas on these vivid debates around debt relief for African countries.
Yes, thank you. There was a letter that was signed by lots of different global leaders, current and previous global leaders, as well as you say, Ngozi, who was a Minister of Finance in Nigeria, as well as a Foreign Minister in Nigeria, and she was the Managing Director of the World Bank, where I worked. Actually, I worked with her, and she's absolutely fantastic, and coordinated with different people, including Gordon Brown. And the idea was to really push the G20, like I mentioned before, to be acting with more urgency in their response to the pandemic, that the health response, and it clearly lays out what we need to do on the health front, and then also on the fiscal response as well as the community response. And on the fiscal response, there is a plea for countries to freeze debt repayments, and it needs to be done quickly. And at the moment, we have a very complicated debt situation, not like what we had on the first round where there was HIPC and debt relief. Nowadays, most countries have multiple levels and types of debt. It could be bilateral debt, multilateral debt, and private debt. And each country in Africa has a different combination of debt from different countries in China. But there certainly is a plea that this needs to be brought forward and coordinated and enacted very quickly. The G20 now have an action plan, of which we are now suggesting they implement as quickly as possible. But I'd like to stress the point that Stanislas just made, and that's around transparency, because we can have issues of debt relief and big fiscal packages, but they have to be implemented in a very transparent way. If there is liquidity that suddenly rises, or there's a big fiscal package that comes from somewhere else, from the World Bank or the IMF, then there must be a way that these fiscal packages are going to those who need it most. And that could be the farmer in her field, it could be the informal sector worker, but absolutely we need some macroeconomic stability, but we also need some transparency. So that is a very key point, and there's no reason why in this time that this point can't be made at the very highest levels, because we have an opportunity to do so. Which links me into just one more point that I want to make, which was also part of that letter, and that's the issue around tax and transparency. And we know that Africa loses billions of dollars a year through illicit financial flows. And this is very, very destructive, and we need this issue on the agenda because the money is just flowing out of the continent. In fact, Africa loses more money on illicit financial flows than Africa receives on any kind of so-called aid money. So again, it's one of these situations that is completely back to front, that hasn't been tackled properly, and yet we need to tackle that now, because this will be the kind of money that African countries desperately need, even more so at this moment in time. So we have issues of tax, we have issues of transparency, and we have issues of illicit financial flows through big multilateral corporations. But around domestic tax, we can also have systems put in place that have greater transparency, that there are less exemptions in the tax system. And we believe that this can be done. There's a lot of fantastic research done by ASSET on this, as well as OECD and other African institutes like UNECA, that say that we can bring in digitalized systems that give us lots more efficiency and effectiveness of raising tax, domestic resource mobilization, which is so needed at this moment in time, which would feed into exactly the issues around economic resilience. So I'll just leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you for these points. Her Excellencies, maybe some points around those two contributions.
Definitely, I agree with what the previous speakers have said, and what I retain, especially from what Caroline had just mentioned, is the issue of governance and the issue of trust in our institution. And how resilient and how strong these institutions are and are going to be will also depend on the governance structure. And this is again where we haven't invested so much in our institutions. Unfortunately, now we are doing it. It will take time because, you know, Africa, if I take the average years of post-independence history, we've got about 60 or 70 years maximum. And it will take time to build this, but it's critical to build our institution. And I think Caroline had rightly mentioned, I'll just take one example in terms of the fiscal issue that we talked about. How many Africans still have their sovereign fund in Africa? That's the question that we have to address. We look at the issue of corruption. Yes, there's a very big issue we have to address. But I think if we are going to reach that level of investment, that level of trust, we have to look again at the economic model. And I think we have seen one of the speakers have just mentioned the issue of transformation. I totally subscribe to this. And I think as from last year, I think at least at the beginning of this year, we are seeing one major opportunity which is coming for the African continent through the Africa Free Trade Continental Free Trade Agreement that many countries have ratified. So that already is providing us with a domestic market of 1.2 billion, which we should be able to capitalize, which should be able to transform our resources, because yes, if we are going to be forever an exporter of raw material, we will never see the innovation that we can do through transformation and through manufacturing on our continent. And who says innovation? Who says transformation? Who says processing of raw material means creating jobs for our youth? And we know that Africa is a young continent. And by 2050, we are positioning ourselves to be supplying 35% of the workforce to the world with a population of roughly 2 billion. But having said this, the other nasty figure is almost over 50% of Africa is going to be urbanized. So what happens to this land where we need cultivation? Now, to what extent are we going to invest in that space? Because don't forget that African continent has 60% of the world arable land. And we are sitting, as we speak, on a business which is worth at least $1 trillion. Not forgetting that by investment in agriculture, we are going to provide jobs again. We're also going to ensure food security. And in the face of new pandemic, this is going to provide us with the resilience that we need. Providing food security, providing energy security, providing water security. Africa is also the blue continent. There is plenty of water resources here. But how do we, and of course I haven't talked about the mineral resources because this is something that has been touched on before. Why do we need to do that? Why do we need to invest in our institution? Is because Africa is young, and unfortunately, with 1.2 billion people we have on this continent, we are only generating less than 2% knowledge. And if we don't generate the knowledge, again, I come back to my previous point, how do we ensure that this knowledge, these resources we have will work for us? And we need, again, to generate this. And we also need to look at one area which, again, we are very weak, the intellectual property. How do we safeguard our intellectual property? Because up until we don't safeguard it, we will not be providing solution to the community, because these ideas and all these data will be lost, will be published in the public space, and again, it's data lost. So all this, of course, investment through the bandwidth, because what we have seen over the pandemic is green shoots emerging in terms of addressing the digital economy. And for example, we have seen distribution being done online, more sales happening online. And how are we going to empower our young people through these tools of technology? And of course, the transformation that has been mentioned by previous speakers. Now, we have spoken about the governance, we have certainly the political system. Again, the debate is now raging. Is democracy the only form of governance? Increasing what's coming out is democracy is one of the options. Again, open to debate. And I'm sure that will provide fantastic debates as to what kind of model that we have, because we have seen some countries where the power has been put at the level of the presidency. Some people have been very critical of that country. But to me, that country is a potential model for development because the necessary, the people are fed, the people are being educated, and it is showing promise. So again, these are issues, but in terms of governance, granted, we need to have a governance which is more inclusive, where it is reflective of good practices, and we have to look how it's going to operate on the short, medium, and of course in the long term, because Africa history post-independent is still very young. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may add just one thing.
Yeah, please, Stanislas. Yeah.
Your Excellency, I know exactly what you're saying, but in the meantime, should we hope to have an enlightened president that will actually have a vision, or should we have strong institution that will actually allow any leader who come in place to be able to do things in cooperation with the other institution and assure good governance and transparency? Because I mean, we have one case, we have few cases in Africa where you have strong leaders who come and then do things because they have a strong vision, but it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable because if that leader goes and somebody else is come and it's not, does not have the same vision, then we have a problem. So we rather invest in having strong institutions that creates that balance of power and that environment that is feasible to be able to put in place good public policy and good implementation process and monitoring process and control process to be able to move forward.
I totally agree with you. And this is what I stressed on the point. We need to have strong institutions. People come and go, leaders come and go, but institutions stay. Having said this, if you look at the history of Africa, again, post-colonial history, 54, 55 countries, we used to have generals at the helm of countries. Things are moving. Now we're increasingly seeing engineers, we're increasingly seeing lawyers and doctors and all the rest of it coming at the helm. So it's a gradual process. I agree that time is running out on us because we're finding that we have to provide for young people. So we need to have, again, we need to keep on investing in our institutions. Local institution, regional one, I think you have mentioned UNECA, which is doing a great job. So all these institutions have to be built, but they have to be built with capacity that we will train, and we should be able to retain, but of course, retention of the brain is an issue. I'm really talking about developing the ecosystem where we can at least promote brain circulation to begin with, and then eventually talk about brain gain, because that's an issue that we cannot address upfront because we haven't created the appropriate ecosystem to be able to hold back these talents for Africa. So up until we build that ecosystem, we're going to have to move around in a very kind of handicapped manner until we convince these talents to come and work for the continent. But we need also to help inculcate this notion on the continent that there has to be pride in Africa. We have to be able to eat African. We have to be able to wear African. And we have to start valuing our own people, because up so far, we haven't done a good job on it. And this is something that we need to do through our education system. And I'll just quickly just mention one example. Increasingly, when we talk about the alphabet, we say A is for apple and B for something else, etc., etc. But how many people in a village out in DRC or any other country, they haven't even seen an apple. So how do you tropicalize that education system to make it to retain the attention of our young child? So learn to bring it to the grassroots level. So again, have the transformation of our education system on the continent that will resonate with our kids. So these are things that, of course, should be work in progress for the time being. But yes, at the end of the day, it has to be institution, and strong institutions.
Thank you so much. And it is a good transition to the third subject around education, employment, and youth. Her Excellency advocates a lot for youth empowerment, for education. And yeah, statistics show that almost 10 million of young Africans come onto the labor market every year. And Caroline was really stressing this point. This pandemic will dig a lot of inequalities in terms of access, specifically to a labor market. But this pandemic also reveals a lot of opportunities in terms of digital tools, digital transformation. This question will go to Caroline. How you think, Caroline, we can restart in Africa the employment machine and train, propel tomorrow's human capital?
Yes, thank you. I just really probably want to pick up some of the points that were raised earlier and build on them to answer your question. And one of them that I would like to focus on is this issue of the food import bill for Africa, which at the moment is around 35 to 40 billion a year. So Africa is bringing in every year $30 to $40 billion worth of food, when, as Her Excellency has said, Africa has some of the most valuable arable land which isn't being used. And as Stanislas has said also, we need to do things that are domestically focused. We need to produce things for the domestic market. So one of the areas, and Ameenah Adébissi, who is the head of the African Development Bank, says this beautifully. He said, you know, agriculture in Africa should not be a development project, it should be a business opportunity. And to me, that's the crux of the transformation of that sector. And at the moment, in some countries, I was just reading this morning, in fact, the average age of the farmer, but I'm not sure, was around 54 years. And yet here is a fantastic opportunity to use digital processes, whether it be marketing or whether it be, you know, financial payments, to transform this sector. And it's already happening, because quite frankly, Africa has some of the most innovative young people on the planet. And we all know that, and we've seen this time and time again. And you know, at the moment, this moment in time, when you can't get your contact lens, right, because your borders are closed, why should you be going to France? There's some young people somewhere who will put that together in 5 days and find the technology and make sure that it works, because we can do that. And in fact, Ngozi was just saying, Ngozi is also the chair of Gavi. And she was just saying on a podcast I was listening to this morning, she says 95% of the pharmaceuticals that Africa needs are imported. And yet we have the capacity in South Africa and Nigeria, just for example, where we could put that production in place. So it's like you were saying, why are we importing all of these things that we grow ourselves? Why are we importing chocolate when we grow cocoa? Why are we importing petrol when we're pulling the stuff out of the ground? So, I mean, there's just an enormous, you know, opportunity. It's already there, though. You know, and that's what's frustrating. It's hard to get the narrative right. It's hard to get a balanced narrative. We need to do it more, but it's not like it's not already happening. There are enormous amount of innovations. I mean, look at Kenya with M-Pesa. They were out there in front. They were really pushing this, and now it's gone global. You know, so it's not like Africa is behind. Africa is in front, and you see this time and time and time again. Now, my concern related to what the conversation was a little bit before, is there's a disconnect between this incredible young population that's coming through with the ideas, with the energy, and really forward future looking, and many of the leaders. And this disconnect is very uncomfortable, but it's not an unusual disconnect. We see this disconnect between the people and the presidents in many countries. In my country, in the United States, for example. So this is not something that is, oh, Africa with these leaders. No, it's not. But leaders need to change everywhere, right, to enable this incredible innovation of their people to be realized. And the second point I just want to make very quickly, if we're talking about spaces for innovation, spaces for great potential, it's the energy sector. I mean, I worked on this with Kofi and Annan, and you know, it's just so exciting, the energy sector in Africa. They are not strangled, many of the countries are not strangled by this heavy electricity grid like we are in old Europe. No, Africa has this huge potential to really do a lot of green energy, right? And go forward with doing a lot of green energy. And this can be done in so many different ways, using innovation, using entrepreneurship. And you see this happening already, because at the moment, there's over 640 million people in Africa who do not have access to electricity. So that is something that is very urgent, and yet you can see in many countries, they are pushing this agenda. It's a crisis, but they're pushing the agenda. So there's your two narratives. We've got this really big problem. Oh, but look, there are so many exciting things happening. Small scale, medium scale, mini grids. You know, on your hut, you've got your small solar panel. Your children are able to study in the evening. So transformation is happening. Is it happening quickly enough? No. Do we have the right political systems to push it? Not really. But the leaders will change. The leaders will change because the young people are there and they are asking a lot of questions.
If I may step in on the education system, I think as His Excellency rightly point out, we have to have a model that is adequate to our realities. And she took the example of the apple. It's a very simple example, but it's the reality. How do you ask someone to identify a letter to a fruit that is never seen? It doesn't make much of a sense. And in a lot of country in Africa, there's this way of how can I say that? Of taking a model from developed countries and trying to paste them into the system, and it certainly doesn't work. If you look, there's countries here in this zone who actually spend 24% of the budget, almost a quarter of the budget, the yearly budget on education. So it means that is a priority, but the results are catastrophic. If you look at the results on different exams, and you see a less than 50% rate of success. So there is a problem. It doesn't mean that it's not a priority. It means that the money that is invested is not well invested. So this is the first thing. The second thing is perhaps the model of education that they want to impose in the country is inadequate to the reality of the type of student they have. If they're wondering, they say, well, this is the same system we had 30 years ago, and people were very successful, but it was 30 years ago. So you don't have the same type of student, you don't have the same type of environment, everything have evolved. So they need to adapt the education policy to the new environment, to the new type of world we're living in, to the new type of student they have. And also the type, they have to adapt the type of teacher and a professor to the type of student they have also. So this inconsistency and this incoherence makes the result that we have, regardless of the money that they put in, because 25% of the budget of a country, that's a lot of money. Put in the education system, and then you don't get the result that you're supposed to have. The second thing is, when you want to link the education system to the employment of the young when they graduate from college, you realize that the different subject that is studying at school is not in adequation with the type of job we have on the market. So if you educate people, you educate students, and then when they come out, the degree that they have does not correspond to any job on the market, you're training some future jobless people. That's what you're training. I mean, you're certainly going to have people who have a good level of intellectual, but if they can't use it, then we have a problem. And then in many African countries, we have these challenges, these two major challenges. The type of education system you put in place, and also the adequation between the education and the private sector or the job market in general. And also, there's no relationship between the private sector and schools and universities. It is important to create that synergy between private sector and the education system in a way that, you know, students already know what to expect when they come, or the private sector can actually help in putting together education packages that will actually serve the private sector when they come out of the school. So those are the things that I believe the government should focus on, establish a true adequation between the education system and the job market, and also in terms of education itself, have a system that is adequate to the environment and adequate to the reality and adequate to the evolution of the type of student they have. The student that you had 20 years ago or 30 years ago are not the same here today. With the introduction of the digital world, you have different type of student and different way of learning. So if the way of learning is not adapted and the way of teaching these kids is not adapted, we are continuing to put more funds and the result will be actually still mediocre.
So I just want to make a very point, if I may.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I just want to read a quote of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who, as you know, was the president of Liberia, and she heads up the Transformation Leadership Panel, which is looking at how to transform Africa. And what she said about COVID, she said, when I quote, "This is an opportunity for all governments, rich and poor, north and south, to think about reform that has been lacking for a long time." And, you know, this is many things that we've already discussed today that fits in with that. But, you know, the education system, it's so painful, right? It's so painful to change everywhere, right? But in Africa, what we were finding, I used to work for the Education Commission, what we were finding in Africa, and that was with President Kikwete, we would visit the heads of state across Africa and we would talk about education. And, you know, Stanislas, he's right. I mean, the African countries are investing a huge amount of their budget, some countries, like you say, up to 25% in education, but the education outcomes are not great. And there's a twin crisis in many of the countries across Africa where the children are not in school, and if they are in school, they're just not learning. So you see the quality of education is terrible. So you're investing a lot of money, you're not getting the results you want. And African leaders are the ones that we spoke to were all really concerned about this, because they make the link between, like you were doing, Her Excellency, the link between education and culture, education and stability, education and resilience. And they're going, I've put all this money into this system and it's not working. And I think this education system it's critical now. This crisis, like you were saying, this is our opportunity to think the education system through very differently. What are we teaching children in school? And it's very boring, quite frankly. It's very boring and it's quite torturous for a lot of children. Why are we torturing our children? It could be so exciting, but it needs to be reformed and it needs to be relevant, like you were saying, and it needs to be completely linked in to the job market and the private sector at the top end. So yes, I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. No, I just want.
Excellency.
Yeah. I just wanted to just quickly just add to what has been said, because a lot has been said. Our education system has to position Africa within the realms of the fourth industrial revolution. And as you have said, again, we're dragging on our historical legacy, because in the colonial days, we used to educate administrators. We never used to educate our government to be technical driven, to be driven by technicians. And yes, our education system has to be transformed totally. And again, we have to look at two issues here: the upskilling, the reskilling, and the de-skilling and reskilling of our youth. The other thing that we have to also invest in is how to make these young people landing on the job market every year, 12 million graduates, and these are the World Bank figures. How do we create jobs? There's no way we can create jobs. So we have to make them become entrepreneurs, so that they become job creators and not job seekers. And the thing is that Africa, we have to keep on producing knowledge and not just become consumer of knowledge. But to be able to do that, we need to be able to train, make the education and the training relevant. We need to invest in that space around universities. That's why I mentioned the IP issue before. How to create that space, incubators, how to produce the accelerators when ideas have been fully matured. And this is only when that, we will roll out a quality education that will respond to one and all, but with a big focus on science and how to make science relevant, how to demystify science, and how to bring that girl child in the sciences. We have spoken a little about agriculture. Agriculture is driven mostly by women. So these are things that we have to bring our full human capital. And I've been saying as well, Africa will not succeed in any revolution on the continent until we bring to bear 100% of a human capital, men and women together. But definitely, we need to have an education that speaks to the development of this continent. We need to have quality education that our kids can relate to. We need to have education as the basis for stability, for cultural identity, for cultural development, for everything that we can think of. Education has to be at the basis of it. And I've been saying that all along, and I think I will keep on saying this until the narrative sinks in, because we need to have quality education that really speaks to the development of this continent.
Maybe we can quickly close as time is running. Okay, I will just have a quick point just to close, okay, in terms of how do you see Africa in the world after this pandemic? We have seen China rising. We have seen how America is isolating. How do you see the Africa positioning in the next world? And that will be your closing words. Everyone.
Can I start?
Yeah, quickly, yeah.
I think Africa has a great future, if only by the virtue that Africa is a young continent, but that success will be defined on how much we invest and what kind of leadership we actually bring on the continent so that we can leapfrog into the fourth industrial revolution with all the resources working for us. Thank you. I'll take leave.
Thank
now.
you so much. Thank you so much, Mrs. President.
Bye.
It was an honor. Thank you. Caroline.
Well, yes, I think we have a completely different balance of power in the world. There are, before we used to say, here's the rich countries, here's the poor countries. I don't think that exists any longer. There are poor, vulnerable people everywhere in the United States, in the UK. So it's a very different geopolitical situation than we've ever seen before. And we can see that this kind of pandemic hit all sorts of countries, regardless of what their, seemingly rich status was. So I would say that we need to rethink our balance of power within the world and see where Africa is situated, because Africa is the continent where there is so much energy and so much innovation and so much change. But the African continent is part of the globe. And we're all interconnected. So Africa will succeed if we get some better global coordination, and Europe will do better if there's better global coordination, and so will the United States and Latin America and Asia. So I would give a big plea for better multilateralism, better global coordination, better global resilience, and then we'll see everybody the whole ship will rise. But we need to have much better global coordination. At the moment, we just don't have that. But I believe that this virus will change some very powerful people's opinions of the value of global cooperation and multilateralism.
Thank you so much, Caroline.
Thank you.
Stanislas.
I think that what is really important to know is that Africa is going to play a major role in this new era. But the position that, or the role and the importance of Africa are going to have will depend on its capacity to reinvent itself, its capacity to realize that he has a high potential in terms of transforming his economy and transforming the way he does business. And Africa should actually capitalize on this situation to drop its barriers with this ZLECAf treaty that has been actually put in place. For Africa to be strong, Africa has to be together, which means that a country needs to work together. This is why I regret that we didn't have the time to talk about regionalization, but this is the future of Africa. Africa will grow stronger together. If countries starting to have economic and cultural relationship within Africa, and if the market of most African countries is Africa, and if most Africa understand that they have to facilitate the circulation of goods and people within Africa, and we become at one point a strong and unified entity, then Africa will play a strong role, because Africa will be strong within before being strong outside. This strength has to be built in first. The possibility of me as an Ivorian decide today to go to Cameroon, and tomorrow I take a plane, I go to Cameroon to do business, I don't have to get a visa. Be able to go to Egypt, be able to go everywhere. And this is the first thing. The second thing is African countries have to start to neutralize the forces when it comes to addressing certain issues outside. We have to see this unity. This is very important. And also the third thing is be interesting that Africans start at the Pan-African level, decisions that be made that African countries need to specialize. Some countries will put an emphasis on research and development, some other on agriculture, some other technology and so forth. And this will be an interesting thing because everybody will put an effort and concentrate investment in one country for specific skills. Okay. And if we start doing that in different countries, all country or 54 countries invest in one country for specific skills, then Africa will be a continent that is actually specialized in different sectors. And this is something that will actually help Africa grow strong. So we have to be strong within before starting counting as a strong entity for outside. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stanislas. Thank you so much. Thank you, Caroline, for being a part of this rich conversation. Thank you so much, Her Excellency Ameenah GURIB, for being a part of this conversation. We talk about reimagining the future. We talk about reinventing the future. Those are the key to recover together within, to recover better and to recover stronger. And more than ever, we believe in the INFORAFRICA Alliance that there is a momentum to build Africa differently and to really build the difference, to rebuild Africa, to build a better Africa for the next generation. Thank you so much for being a part and for following this conversation. The conversation is ongoing and the actions as well, are ongoing. Thank you so much. Bye.
I'm in for Africa. I'm in it for Africa.
I'm in for Africa.
I am in for Africa.
I'm in for Africa.
I